Last week, OpenAI announced the general availability of their search tool. Previously in a beta, it was only open to a select amount of paid users that was actually a separate product. Now it's baked in ChatGPT natively in the text prompt window. It doesn't detect a query for your search. You have to still click on the globe to be able to actually initiate it. A lot of people have been high on the ChatGPT search, or maybe even just generative AI search in general. I'm going to use this video to break down two quick examples of how Gen AI search works using ChatGPT, Perplexity, and native Google, which I have Google experiments turned on for this to use generative results. Now, before I get started, a few things to keep in mind. First, all large language models were trained on content off the internet. They did not memorize anything. The training is to create a predictive model for the next word or token in a response. I won't get into the nuances right now, but just know that the large language models have not indexed anything. Thus, they need a search tool to help them understand the search request that you're actually having. For Perplexity, they use Google's index. They have an API, they connect into it. We know this. For ChatGPT, it's been confirmed that they're actually using Bing, which also makes sense because of their relationship with Microsoft and all the different features and functionality that they've been doing over the last year. So out of the gate, both of these tools are using established search indexes to actually power the search results that they're going to generate. That doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way in the future. In fact, if you're not discussing internally how your company's content does and does not show up in generative AI models and how you want them to scan your site and index your content, or at least take it into consideration, whether it be for training or a future search product, you really need to be considering that right now. You need to be having internal conversations because it's going to be a thing. And very soon. You want to make sure you're actually implementing things in your robot.txt file on your website, kind of blocks and permits what bots and agents can do. If that sounds like a foreign language to you, don't worry. Someone in your company knows what that means, but you want to start talking about it now so you can actually have a strategy. So I created two example search queries to compare against: Perplexity, ChatGPT, and Google. I wanted something that could elicit a generative response for each platform. Now, Perplexity and ChatGPT by default will assemble information from several sources and create a new generative response. You will see how that works out here in a second. Google, by nature of how it was built, does not work the same way. Their new generative AI tool, their like new little companion experiment, does a little bit of this, but you'll see how it's just different. So we're entering another aspect of the paradigm shift of how people are going to start using technology and interact with it to get answers to the questions that they have. So let's go through those results, and I'll show you how each platform does. Then I will share some thoughts on the future of search just in general here at the end. Okay, so the first query, let's use something timely. The US elections are this week, so I generated or used a query called, why do we have the Electoral College? That was my first, kind of example there. So first up, we have Perplexity. As you can see, Perplexity has pulled in some video results here right off the top after it did this query. It's cited some sources there. In addition, it created a response based on those several sources. What I like about Perplexity specifically, and this is universal, it's not just about this specific example, is that at the end of its answer, it offers related questions or statements for you to explore. Regardless if you're doing search, regardless of whatever you're doing, it does this by default, but I do like that it actually offers that at the end. So if you didn't actually get what you wanted out of that query, that response, you actually have another way to expand upon that, and it gives you some logical next questions to ask based on what you originally generated your question on. I like that. You'll see some of that come up in another way here in a minute. When you ask Google the same question, I use the same query for all these examples, you actually don't get a generated answer, which is really interesting. Instead, you get an excerpt or a snippet from its top website, usa.gov. So to Google, this is the definitive source, and thus it pulls in an excerpt to show the visitor. You're not going to get a generated anything. The rest of the page sets a standard. It's got the standard set of results. You get some sponsored things, the top 10 links based on their SEO rankings. It's just the way it works. Nothing really special about this one, but it's just a standard result. Just wanted to show as an example. So what Google does, which is similar to Perplexity though at the end, is that it does give you, before you go to the next page or want to click to another page, is to show you that people also searched for. So again, maybe some of the dynamics of how the Google API works, but it's actually giving you a couple of different additional queries you can go look into if you didn't actually get the answer you wanted out of your first page. Similar to Perplexity, but still different in the context of how it's actually delivered at the end of the day. For ChatGPT, The generated answer is fairly simple. Just a paragraph with 3 cited sources. Pretty straightforward response, but no additional thinking to share or options. You can ask for you can always ask follow-up questions in the prompts, but there's no prompts or suggestions for you to then take it even further. How would you actually compare those 3 different types of results? I actually think Perplexity is probably the best out of all of them. Gives you some aggregated answers. It gives you a link to a video. And it clearly has aggregated or generated an answer based on several sources. The Google one just straight up said, here it is, USA.gov. This is where you're going to get it from. And then ChatGPT, pretty straightforward answer, but I would call it pretty lackluster at the end of the day. And again, coming from its different index based. So now you have to think, how does Bing's index differ than Google's index and out of the different nuances between those two things? Okay, let's get into a second example. For this, I wanted to see how each of these tools could aggregate content from several sources. So I chose the query, popular Chicago attractions for tourists. Traditionally, when you think about having to look at all these, you're basically looking at listicles, right? So every tourist attraction might come into something from like a TripAdvisor or your local tourist blog, but there are dozens of sites that share this content, and I wanted to see if any of these tools could actually do a decent job of synthesizing this content into one response. So first up, again, we're going to use Perplexity. Perplexity grabs at least 10 sources before it displays an answer. The answer has images at the top and links to a larger gallery. I like how Perplexity broke down different categories for its answer, from iconic landmarks to museums and culture to architectural sites and even down to outdoor spaces. You can see the different breakdowns here. Overall, I think it curated a pretty comprehensive response given the little context that it was given. Now, if you move to Google this time actually did do a generative AI response. However, it was pretty limited to just 5 key attractions, and most of them are pretty obvious ones if you know anything about Chicago. I'm from Chicago, so maybe they're just obvious to me. And then basically anything that I kind of share when I talk about stuff when people ask. It then shared its typical fare of links, sponsored links. Did have a knowledge graph widget this time on the city of Chicago in general. But what I also did like about the Google results, which you didn't get anywhere else, is events this weekend. So it actually took some of the context of saying you're searching for popular tourist attractions in Chicago. Maybe you're going to travel there this weekend. Here's some actual things that are actually happening. And this is where Google's index of content and things like events and other search query type of needs can show up different than you're going to get from any of the generative AI tools. You're not going to see Gen AI responses take time, the context of time, into consideration. Lastly, let's look at ChatGPT again. Unlike the other two, this response was about as straightforward as it gets, with a bolded list of options, about 10, most of them big landmarks with a link to its source. It's a simple query, and you got a basically straightforward answer. Nothing is wrong here. Like I said, I'd probably recommend most of these, if not all of them, myself if I actually was asked by someone who's coming to town. But it is pretty straightforward as far as his answer is concerned. So is Gen AI better than Google? Today, I really think it's just different. I'm not sure if it's any better or worse, given the fact that both of those tools are using the indexes from 2 major popular search engine platforms. But what I mean by different is that it's an aggregation and the synthesis of this information from the search results, which is what I would expect a Gen AI tool to do when you have search functionality put into it. But by its nature, Gen AI is more conversational. And this is where I think search is going to have to change. I think this is how we're going to see search change. It's not that search is going to be different in the sense that you still want to get an answer and you want to get links to that source and you want to have that information so you can explore more, at least until Gen AI tools take into consideration things like time and other sources of information to give a more definitive result. But what I do think is that Gen AI tools can keep that context of the search query to the next query, to the next thing that comes in, so it can expand upon and deliver more on that result and that answer than a normal Google would or Bing would, because I don't think they keep that context from query to query, even if you're in the same session. It might to a degree, but I don't think to the same degree that a Gen AI tool is going to do it. I also think one of the things that people are liking about a search generated from a Gen AI tool like ChatGPT and Perplexity is that they're ad-free. We know that Perplexity is going to start introducing ads at some point into its results. It just kind of has to, I think, from its own revenue model, but it's definitely going to start to do it. And I would not doubt at some point that ChatGPT is going to find a way to have sponsored or other results or some other ad revenue model that comes into it as well. Ideally, none of them will do this. This is one of the things we love about the new tools today, is that they are ad-free, especially if you're a paid subscriber like I am for most of these tools. If I'm paying for it, I don't want to see an ad in there. But for the free results or the free versions, you probably will at some point. How this comes to some way, how it manifests is to be determined at some point in time. But I bet you're going to see it here coming into 2025. So let's look at search and how the content is captured and results in Gen AI tools like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, Llama, and more. It's a budding topic of conversation. How does your content get into it, and how does it appear when you type in a specific query? I saw the term over the weekend called GEO instead of SEO. GEO standing for Generative Engine Optimization. Yes, this is a real thing. And yes, I think it's something that we all need to be talking about if you are a company that has content and a website and a source. The models today are just not geared to actually for search, but I guarantee you that the next ones will be, or at least they'll take that kind of multimodal aspect of it into a consideration. Instead of we got vision and video and audio, but how is the content generated, going to be search, because search is such a popular thing that people do on the internet. So why not have that as a major feature and functionality of your tool that you have today? Again, if you are not thinking about this internally, if you're not talking about it internally, you should start talking about it, because everyone's going to start looking for themselves, their own company. How do they turn up in results? Thinking about all the different nuances of what search is and what SEO is. It is going to be a thing to think about for generative AI tools, and how are those companies solving for this idea of search as a use case. So have you been playing with generative AI search engines? What's your thoughts on the differences? Do you find it useful or easier to accomplish your goals, or is it just better because there are no ads on it? Drop a note and comment, and let's have a conversation.